This is the part where I tell you something awkward about myself. You've been waiting for it. So here it is. So I have this thing where, and maybe it's not entirely just unique to me. I'm sure you've probably talked with that person before, but I mean, have you ever been talking with somebody and it seems like they're only listening to you long enough to be able to tell their own story? I kind of fall in that group. In fairness, I've been working on it for a while, not to get better at it, but to get better at not doing it, right? I find myself listening in order to maybe give correction or to teach or to just tell my own story. And so I've had to do a lot of reflecting. I've had to try to figure out why I am prone to do that. And what I kind of realized is that I'm kind of looking for my place to fit in. And not just fit in, but I'm looking for some kind of significance. I'm looking to figure out how I can contribute, and unfortunately, most of the time, I see that as kind of elevating myself. Now, I've gotten better at it over time. I've struggled against it, and I feel like I'm more victorious than I ever have been, but it makes me feel like I'm in pretty good company that I'm not alone. In fact, just as a really good way of understanding it, there was a study, and maybe it was actually less of a study. It was more of just a fun kind of a competition that was done. But designer and engineer Peter Skillman conducted this interesting competition where he assembled teams of people from all professional walks of life and had them compete against each other in just a simple activity. Now, if you have ever been a part of a team building thing, you've probably had to build one of those towers made of spaghetti. Right? Has anybody ever tried to do that before? Like, that's the worst team building thing. It seems like almost cliche. I'm seeing like a lot of heads shake no, but I feel like every part of my life that I've had to step into a team building opportunity, we had to build some kind of a structure, and the whole purpose of it was to see who emerged to the top as kind of the leader, or where people were falling in place in terms of a team and how to work together to get something accomplished. Well, what Peter Skillman did is he kind of repeated this, but he made it a competition, and he did it all over the world. Now, some of the teams were made up of business professionals. Some were just recent graduates. Some were designers and engineers themselves. Some groups were teachers. And as he went all over the world, one team in particular won time and time again. Here's the surprising part. It was always the team made of kindergartners. Now, I think it would be easy to kind of look at that and say, well, yeah, it's because of the connects that they're always using, or, they're used to building those big blocks, or their whole developmental process is learning how to stack things, but that actually wasn't it. And not only did the kindergartners win time and time again, what the results actually showed is they won by a large margin, usually at least doubling the size of the tower. Now, the tower was simple. It was made up of 20 uncooked spaghetti pieces, 1 yard of transparent tape, 1 yard of string, and 1 standard size marshmallow. And the competition was quite simple. Whoever could build the largest standing tower with the marshmallow on top won. And every single time across the whole world, wherever they did this competition, it was the kindergartners that won at least by double the size. Just fascinating, right? The people that are on these professional teams are trying to strategize, and they're laying out their materials, and they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we maintain structural integrity? How do we bear the load of this marshmallow? Even though it's not a lot, we don't have a lot to work with, and so they're trying to figure out how to make this structurally work out, and they're coming up with plans, and then they're executing, and in the timed trials, they only got so far. What they noticed is the kindergartners had no such inhibitions such as strategizing and planning. They just started grabbing the materials and putting it together. They started talking to one another quite directly, and as as Daniel Coyle, author of The Culture Code, focuses on this study, he realizes this: we focus on what we can see, individual skills, but individual skills are not what matter. What matters is the interaction. What mattered in order to be successful in this competition was actually interaction. And while the interaction of the adults was based around where they fell into place, you see, arguments would pop up in those teams about who was going to be the leader and who was going to be the follower, who was going to have significance in the group and who was going to just do what they were told. But the kindergartners, as you know, they didn't really care about that. They just started interacting with one another. The adults lost track of the objective, which was actually to build the tallest tower, and the kids never once lost objective. So often our objectives and so often our purposes in life are sidetracked by the reality of trying to figure out where we fall in line, trying to prove our significance, trying to show that we are good enough, or that we have leadership ability, or that we have this skill that we've developed. And what we do is we get into relationships, and the relationship becomes all about us coming to the surface, about how interesting I can be. It's about my story, it's about my talent, it's about my skill, and all the while we kind of lose track of the main objective. Thankfully, the cross of Jesus, as we've been talking about the way of the cross of Jesus has the answer for us. It has the way forward, the way beyond my skills, the way beyond my stories, the way beyond my significance. So I want to invite you to turn to John chapter 13. If you've grown up in church, this may very well be a very familiar story, and I want to invite you beyond what is familiar. I want to invite you to hear the story in a new way, with new eyes, with new ears, and just let it soak in. So we are going to be in John chapter 13, and we're going to start at verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Let's pause right there, actually. The interesting thing, and this is a little bit tangential to what we're talking about today, but I find it really, really interesting that to frame all of this, to kick this story off, it describes that Jesus really knew what his place was. As we talk about our place, as we talk about what skills we have, as we talk about where we fit in, Jesus already knew that. Jesus already knew that God had put all things under his power, and that he was coming from God and was going to return to God. So keep that in mind as we go forward, that Jesus understood who he was. And while there's many things that we're going to be able to pull out of this text, it's kind of foundational. One of the conversations that we're going to have a lot of, especially in our day today, is who we are and the value that God has already given us, which is significant. So let's continue on. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said, "Not every one was clean." When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you as an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So let's break this down and let's understand a little bit about how this helps us break the problem of what we see in ourselves and the world around us. So we already talked that everything is under the power of Jesus and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Now, again, this is an important piece of framing the way we understand the passage that follows. Jesus is putting all of this in light of the reality that he has come from the Father and he is returning to the Father. Just previous to this, Jesus had predicted his death. Just previous to this passage, Jesus talked about the reality that the Son of Man, referring to himself, had to be lifted up on the cross for the sake of the entire world, and his disciples really didn't understand that. In fact, they find offense at the reality that somebody who is meant to be the Messiah should have to die in order for that to be accomplished. It's in light of all of this that Jesus does what we see him do here in the text, that he is coming from God and returning to God. It's this idea of Jesus' way of life, and the example that he gives points to the cross. It points to the reality of the cross, not just in the end, but in his life now. And I think it's important for us to realize this, that if our faith is only about the future, if our faith is only about what is to come, then our faith has no bearing on what we do today. The truth is, our faith has every bit of significance for our daily life now. It has impact in what we do. It has impact on what we say and how we interact with one another. And that is the way that Jesus frames this whole passage. After he frames it that way, verse 4, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. Interesting little tidbit is that this is actually where the term man of the cloth comes from. That those who are men or women of the cloth are those who are people of service. It's in the pattern of Jesus, because Jesus took off the robes that actually signified his role and his status, that he was the teacher and that he was Lord, that he was rabbi, and he takes all of that off. He sets aside the reality of what is rightfully his in society, and he puts on a servant's towel. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Now, Peter has a way of kind of sticking his foot in his mouth. We've pointed that out before. But that's not what Peter's doing here. Peter's actually just saying what every single person in the room is thinking. And actually, those who read this first would also be thinking that. The people that John is writing to, all of those believers are seeing what is playing out in the life of Jesus and are just absolutely astounded, because it was well beneath not only the master and the teacher to wash someone's feet, but it was below even the disciples' feet. You see, the disciples of a rabbi were supposed to serve. They were supposed to prepare the meal. They were supposed to make spaces ready. They were supposed to do things to serve the rabbi. That was just kind of the understanding, that as the rabbi poured his life into the disciples, that the disciples would serve the rabbi. It was this kind of mutual relationship. And all Peter is doing here is he's recognizing this break, this actual offensive break in social rank. That Jesus as Lord and Master should never be down on the ground washing feet. Now, one of the things that maybe we don't catch because it's just not what we're used to is the reality that the sandals that people would wear was just simply a strip of leather that was held on by other strips of leather. And their road system was not like ours. Even in the best Roman roads that had been paved with brick and stone, they still would be dusty and animals travel and it would just be absolutely filthy. And so it was the role of the lowest servant in the household that as you enter the house would wash your feet with this water and in this basin. And Jesus himself breaks all social protocols, everything that would be considered right and honorable and good, and he gets down, wraps a towel on himself, and washes the disciples' feet. And Peter calls him out. He says, "What, you are going to wash my feet? I shouldn't even be washing your feet. Somebody else should be, but there's no way you should be washing my feet." Verse 7. Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." And we see in just a second that Jesus does this, and then he explains it to them. But this is kind of like one of those scenarios where, have you ever tried to do something for somebody and they're like, "Hey, wait, just explain this to me." And you're like, "Shut up for just a second, and I'll explain it in a moment. Just let me get through this, and then I'll explain it." That's kind of what Jesus is doing now. He's like, "Hey, Peter, just shut your mouth for a second. Let me get through this, and then I'll explain it." And in true fashion, that's exactly what he does. And then we see even more so as you read the stories of the gospel that the full realization of what Jesus does isn't made known to the disciples until after the crucifixion and burial and resurrection and the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. It's only then that the followers of Jesus truly realize what he has done, even though he goes on to explain it. And I think Jesus understands this. He says, "You don't exactly understand what I'm doing now, but one day you will understand it." Isn't that true for us? Sometimes we're in the middle of life, and we don't exactly understand what God is doing now, but one day we will. One day things will kind of be put in proper perspective. I think that's a good word for all of us, that no matter what you're walking through right now, maybe you're walking through a difficult season and you just don't get it. One day you will. You may not understand now what Jesus is doing, but one day everything will make sense. Verse 8. "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Now Peter's just getting a little bit out of line. He's pushing this whole social protocol thing to the max. And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." This is Jesus laying down the line in true Jesus fashion, Peter pushing back in true Peter fashion, and Jesus just puts it as it is. He says, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." In a sense, Jesus is saying, "Peter, will you really allow your pride to get in the way of entering the kingdom? Will you really allow your need for social standing, will you really allow who you are and who I am to get in the way of what God is doing?" You see, now Peter had kind of overstepped his bounds. He had kind of gone beyond the reality of calling out a break of social protocol, and he now allows his own pride to get in the way, thinking that it is not proper, and if Jesus can't see it, then Peter certainly will make sure that things happen the way they should happen. So Jesus calls him out. "You do not realize what I am doing, but later you will, and unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Verse 9. "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and head as well." Jesus answered, "Oh, those who have had a bath need only wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." Now, what we see Jesus doing here is what Jesus does a lot of times. He points beyond the immediate thing, and he goes to the eternal thing. Beyond the moment to the actual meaning behind the moment. Jesus and his disciples had gathered for the festival of Passover. That's the meal they're sitting down for, and Passover was filled with all sorts of rituals, and one of those rituals would have been the ritual bathing before going into the meal. And so Jesus points back to that they had actually already bathed. They had been ceremonially clean. And if you've been ceremonially clean, if you've bathed, if you're actually physically clean, the only thing that's left to do is to wash your feet as you enter the house, but it's so much more than that. Jesus is pointing to himself as the fulfillment of ultimate cleanliness, of ultimate righteousness. saying again that, Peter, if you have done all of these ceremonial cleansings, the purpose of those was to point to the ultimate cleansing that happens in me. Jesus, throughout the book of John, makes all of these I am statements, and he doesn't do that outright here, but kind of in a way, he says, I am your cleansing. I am your purity. I am the way and your entrance into the life in the kingdom. Verse 12, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes, returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Teacher and Lord, Jesus again picks up on those themes that Peter had already pointed out. Jesus says, yes, this is true. And if I am willing to lay aside everything that is due to my position, everything that is rightfully mine in social standing, everything that I have coming to me, the fact that I should be served and not serving, if I have done this as your Lord and as your rabbi, then you should do this for one another. Nothing should be above you. He goes on to say, I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Jesus is saying you are the servant is not greater than his master. If the master sees fit to lay aside his robes, if the master sees fit to lay aside social protocol, if the master sees fit to lay aside his significance and meaning, then that's what the disciples should do. That's what followers of Jesus should do. They should be willing to set aside everything that is rightfully theirs, everything that is socially acceptable, everything that is true and fitting socially, so that we can serve one another. A messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. Jesus tells them, you do this among yourselves, but also you are being sent to people. So the message then expands. It's not just Jesus asking the disciples to do it among their own relationships. It goes well beyond that Jesus is asking them to do this for everybody. Everybody that they come into contact with, the people that they are going to minister to, the people that they are going to interact with, the people that they meet on the streets and they do life with, this is the example. This is the pattern that Jesus gives them. In this way, they are honoring one another. In this way, they are giving preference and deference to one another. In this way, they live a life that always points to the cross of Jesus. In fact, this brings us full circle all the way back to the context of this passage, where Jesus understood that he had come from God and he was going to God. So he lives this way. That in all the ways that the followers of Jesus are meant to live, we are meant to be pointing to the cross of Jesus. We are asked and called to live our lives in a self-giving and self-sacrificial way. One, in terms of this, that lays down our lives in order to serve others. Just a few chapters before this, Jesus is on the road with his disciples, and they get into a little bit of an argument. They get into an argument about who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus picks up on it, and he calls them out, and he says, if you want to be the first, you have to be the last. If you want to be the greatest, you have to be the servant of all. I think in one small way, Jesus is kind of pointing this out as an illustration of all of the things along the way that he's been telling his disciples. And he says, practically speaking, in our everyday life, this is what it looks like. Be willing to serve in a way no one else is willing to. Be willing to put others so far above yourselves that you would lower yourself to the lowest possible position in the world. Be willing to not think less of yourself, but to think of yourself less. Isn't that the understanding of humility? Not to think less of yourself, but to think of yourself less. Jesus was the picture of humility, and he calls those who follow him into that same picture of humility. The Apostle Paul picks up on this in his letter to the Romans. It's in Romans 12:10 that I think Paul does a really, really good job of kind of summing up this whole understanding, this whole way of life, this lifestyle that points to the cross in all things. Paul points out in Romans 12:10, he says this, "Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves." Let's read that again. "Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves." I like how the New Revised Standard Version actually states this. It states it this way: outdo one another in showing honor. Outdo one another in showing honor. I think this sums up this whole understanding of the lifestyle Jesus is asking his followers to live. Outdo one another in showing honor. Scholar N.T. Wright phrases it this way: compete with each other in giving mutual respect. I'm a competitive person. I've mentioned that a number of times. I'm a competitive person. For me, this kind of gives a little bit of redemption to the idea of being competitive. Right? I oftentimes want to take competition and throw it out because, we're not really meant to compete with each other, but that's not actually what Jesus is telling us. That's not what Paul is summarizing the message of Jesus. He's saying, no, compete with one another in showing honor. Compete with one another. Outdo one another in showing honor to each other. What if we lived in this sort of way? This truly is the way of the cross. This truly is the life lived out in humility. If we think of our interactions as a chance to honor one another above ourselves, to allow ourselves to enter into that posture of a servant, that posture of someone who cares and listens and serves and puts others before ourselves. It's going to take a great amount of humility. It's going to take an understanding, as Dale Carnegie wrote, to be interesting, you have to be interested. To be interesting, be interested. I find this fascinating, and it's been reworded in a number of ways, but the simplest understanding is if we want to live out this lifestyle, one of the things we have to learn how to do is to be less interesting and more interested. It doesn't take long to be in conversation with somebody to find out that they're not as interested in you as you think maybe they should be. They're actually interested in them, and this conversation has just become a conduit for that to be proven. It takes humility to be willing to be less interested. I love how author C.S. Lewis describes an interaction with a humble person. He says this: "Do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble. Nowadays, he will not be sort of greasy, smarmy person." Also, can we just start using the word smarmy more, please? Next time you interact, I don't really know what it means, but maybe you do. Use it with me, please. So not sort of a greasy, smarmy person who is always telling you that, of course, he is nobody. Probably all of you will think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. In fact, he will not be thinking about himself at all. I love that. He's not going to, a truly humble person doesn't think about themselves. In fact, they're probably not thinking about themselves at all. They're not thinking about their humility. They're thinking about you. They've taken this posture of a servant. And I would argue that one of the greatest postures of servanthood that we can take in our world now is just simply genuinely caring about somebody else. Truly being interested in what somebody else is about, what's going on in their life, what matters to them. I find that even in parenting, as I'm trying to parent and trying to gain influence with my kids, that the worst way to gain influence is by getting them interested in what I'm doing. If I want to gain influence in my kids' lives, I have to take interest in what they're doing. I truly have to listen. I have to be interested in what is a part of their lives and the things that they care about. And then I can enter into that with them. Now, what does this actually mean for us? Because here's the reality. I'm not asking us all to take on this humble position and start pulling out water basins and pitchers and adding oils to the water and start washing one another's feet. In fact, that's probably not an overly practical thing, although some of us may very well need it. I know my preteen certainly does. Asa, I'm sorry, I love you. I'm not asking you to wash one another's feet, but here's some really practical ways that I am asking you to maybe consider stepping out and having this lifestyle that points to Jesus. These are ways that we can be less interesting and more interested. And the first one is simply just to meet a need. Find a need in somebody's lives. Maybe bring them a meal. You've all done that so well when people have been in need. It's been a joy to watch how you've made meals and prepared meals and delivered them to people who are in need. But let's take that one step further. What if we just made meals for one another just because? What if, as we're gathering our own groceries, we gathered somebody else's groceries? What if we just really practically met food needs in our neighborhood or in our circles of relationships? What if we just did those really simple things just because? So meeting a need. I remember serving our very first foster family. We had fostered for just under 6 years, and I remember the first placement that we ever had. It was two boys that came to our house, and they showed up just absolutely filthy, and they smelled, and it was heartbreaking seeing them come into this. It was late at night, well beyond what maybe you'd allow your own kids to be up at. And they came into the door, and Janine and I had this beautiful picture of what this moment would be like, where we'd get down on our knees and we'd look them in the eyes and say, "You are safe. You are loved. This is a safe place for you just to be. Look, we have this food for you." We thought this was what it meant. We thought this was how we were going to serve them. This was how we were going to meet their need. But we hadn't really been in this scenario before. So the kids come in and they're just this bundle of energy, and I get down on a knee and I get into the oldest one's face and I say, "Listen." And that's about as far as I got because he ran right for the toys. It was not at all this picture-perfect moment of trying to meet this child's need, because what the reality is that I was still kind of putting my gifts and my talents at the forefront of meeting his needs. I hadn't really looked for where his need was. His need was just to simply be a place where a kid could play. He wanted toys, and he wanted to interact with other kids. He just wanted to be a kid. He didn't want to have to deal with all the trauma that was in his life. And because I hadn't listened for the need, I didn't know what the need was. If we want to meet needs around us, we have to listen for the need. We have to look for the need. Not the one that we think is just the easiest on the surface, but the one that is actually there. So I'm encouraging you that as we seek to serve one another, find the true need. Find the need that's beneath the surface need. The next way we can do this is simply helping around the house. You know what these jobs are. All of us have projects. All of us have things that we're doing around the house, whether it's raking the lawn or mowing it, trimming it, sweeping, maybe in the winter, shoveling some snow. There are all sorts of projects and little things that are happening around the house that we have the opportunity to step in. If we really want to be a community that lives a life that points to the cross, then we will give our time for one another. We will lend a hand when a hand is needed. These are incredibly simple, maybe even simplistic things, but when we are having a mindset of outdoing one another in showing each other honor, then this will just be a way of life for us. This will just be the thing that we do, and the thing that we do a lot. It'll become a little bit of a competition. How much can I help you with, and how much can you help me with? In fact, that's really the understanding of honor, is serving one another. And another really practical way we can do that is simply helping out around the house. I remember when we had gotten into a pattern of this with people that we had done life with, and it just became normal for one of us to call the other one up and say, "Hey, my roof is leaking, can you come help me fix it?" And then our whole community would come around us and we'd go fix it. When it was time to rake the leaves, we took turns. We'd go from one house to the next house to the next house, and we'd get everybody taken care of because we were outdoing one another in honor. It was also a lot easier. Right? It was just really practical. So we can meet needs, we can help around with projects, but I think one of the greatest ways we can honor one another is to simply listen. I know we've mentioned it before, but simply listening. Not looking to interject our own story, not waiting to give advice, not waiting to prove how valuable we are in relationship, but simply listening. We have a severe lack of listening in our culture. We are a culture that is just trying to press our opinions and convince others and win arguments, but the reality is nobody's listening. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. It just takes listening. In fact, most mental health experts, you know what they do? You know what they are really, really good at? Listening. It's incredibly healing. I would say that 90% of my role as a pastor with people is just listening. People need to feel heard. We're going through stuff and people just want to get it out. We have hurts and we have baggage and we just need to share it with somebody. Just listen. No advice, no agenda. Not waiting to work your story in. I'm not waiting to work my story in. We are just simply there for the other. And we become less interesting and more interested. These aren't mind-blowing, complex ways. They're incredibly simple. But this is the call of those who are going to live in a way of the cross. Those who are going to put others before ourselves. Those who want to live in the posture of a servant. This is what foot washing looks like for us today. Simply serve. And be willing to do the things that other people don't want to do. Let's pray.